Good afternoon. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. This is Adam Pincus. I'm the founder of PincusCo Media. We're a real estate publication and data platform. Our products include the newsletters, posts, and data subscriptions, and we have links to these products in the chat. Today, we'll be discussing the rising foreclosure, or sort of soon to be rising foreclosure, or expected rising foreclosures in New York City. As New York commences its second lockdown, there are several uncertainties surrounding daily life. Based on PincusCo's analysis, we noticed a slight uptick in new filings, but not much. There's actually a very low level of active new foreclosure filings. This excludes, our analysis excluded hundreds of refiled foreclosure actions. They were actually conversions from older paper filings. To get a sense of the market right now, we're joined by David Schechtman, Senior Executive Managing Director at Meridian Capital Group. David executes transactions throughout the city and across multiple asset classes with particular emphasis in note sales and bankruptcies. Leslie Berkoff is a partner with Moritt, Hock, and Hamroff. She serves as the chair of the firm's dispute resolution practice group. She concentrates her practice in the area of bankruptcy and restructuring litigation and corporate workouts. Chris Gorman is a partner at Abrams Fensterman. He does he leads the construction litigation department and concentrates his practice in all phases of the complex commercial litigation in state and federal court. And David Goldwasser is a partner at FIA Capital Partners. He is the founder and principal of FIA Capital Partners, a real estate company that specializes in complex distressed commercial and residential real estate situations, such as workouts, bankruptcies, and litigation. Before we start the conversation, I'd like to remind our listeners that you can ask questions at the Q&A portion at the last 10 or 15 minutes. We'll be taking them throughout the panel, so please chat them or send them by email. And so with that, I'd like to begin. I wanted to ask Chris just to give a sense of sort of where the market is today.
So, good afternoon, everybody. In our discussions preparing for this, I really do think that the overall answer to that is an asset class by asset class answer. And there's no, one prepackaged, I think, answer to that. But just to address, say, just the residential space and the statistics that we're all going to look at later, there are virtually no, relatively speaking, residential foreclosure filings in Manhattan or in any of the other boroughs. And I think what the conclusion that leads me to reach is that we are at some point here going to see an avalanche of those, because there's just no way, given job losses and the like, that there isn't going to be an avalanche of those filings. So given all the moratoriums, a lot of lenders, institutional lenders imposing their own COVID holds, I think that the residential filings are on the sideline for now, but they're coming, and there's going to be a lot of them. And I don't know exactly when they're going to hit, because a lot of it's going to depend on when these moratoriums and these self-imposed litigation holds go away. But I think it's safe to say that there's going to be an avalanche, perhaps something along the lines of 2008-esque in the not too distant future here in the residential foreclosure world.
Leslie, just following up on that, can you give a sense of like what you're seeing and how you're planning for the next year?
So, I think it's appropriate. This is almost like a real trickle down effect, for lack of a better word. As the corporate entities sort of are impacted and restrict themselves based upon COVID, lack of funds, and everything else that we see, it starts to trickle down. Just focusing on the residential for a moment, it starts to focus and trickle down to the employees that are losing their jobs, to the owners that no longer have a source of income, and that'll eventually hit their inability to pay their mortgages. And so that's what ends up happening, is it takes time for this to sort of wind its way through the system. PPP money has run out. There may or may not be another stimulus package. Assuming there's nothing or it's not sufficient, I think he's correct that we are going to see this very significantly. In terms of where that's going to hit, the foreclosures usually track where the greatest unemployment is. And so when you look at larger cities, you're going to end up with disproportionate numbers just because of the amount of people who are compacted into a specific locale. So New York City, being very dense population-wise, is going to have skewed numbers as opposed to going to the Midwest, where people may be impacted, but it's going to be much more spread out. But I do think you're initially going to see it in more of New York and Chicago and, Houston and Atlanta, some of the higher population cities. Insofar as commercial is concerned, what I'm seeing is much more along the lines of banks doing the following. There is a period of time, because I work primarily with the lenders, there's a period of time where people kick the can down the road.
Leslie, if I can interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
Just just talk about New York, though, just in all the
that's fine. But in terms
Mm-hmm.
of New York, that's what you're going to see it in terms of it, because it's so dense in population and there's so much industry here that's impacted. You're going to see people, the residential coming up on the rise. In terms of the commercial, it's going to be the same thing. The lender's kicking the can down the road for a period of time, and there's a point at which a lender's just not going to continue to kick it. If you're not getting your rents paid or your mortgage paid or any of that paid, there's a point at which they'd just rather start taking the properties back into their own portfolios.
What about
and so
this issue that we're sort of talking that it might take years and years to get anything through the court system?
So you've got two, right? So you have two halves of it. So the lender has run out of patience. They'd rather just have the property back versus having a tenant that's sitting there and doing nothing, or an owner that's sitting there and doing nothing. So here's where the rubber kind of meets the road. If you're looking for a traditional foreclosure litigation, depending on what county in New York you're looking at, it could be 2 to 3 years to get a property through a foreclosure process. In Kings, it's an average of about 3 years. So if you commence your foreclosure process as a lender, it doesn't happen tomorrow. It's going to take a significant period of time to get to the end of that result. And then the bumps along the way are as follows. Whether they wait until you get to a foreclosure judgment or they want to stall the process sooner, you are going to end up having that borrower file for bankruptcy. When they do that, let's say the lender has a right to have a receiver appointed. And under that, they go in during the foreclosure process to take the property back. That's checkmate is the borrower saying, you know what, I want to retain control of my property. I'm going to file a bankruptcy petition to oust the receiver, because that happens pretty much automatically in a bankruptcy filing. You take control.
I'm going to dig into that a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So let's hold that, because I want to get into that sort of process. Right now, just want to ask David, in terms of looking at the commercial version of what Leslie's talking about, can you give some sort of sense of that?
You're on mute, David.
And thanks for having me here. Good afternoon, everybody. So I tend to agree with what everybody's saying, but commercial, let's be clear for all of our listeners today. Commercial in New York City, we define as any edifice that has more than 4 residential dwellings in it. So even some of these tiny buildings in Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, and even Manhattan, that may have a bodega downstairs, you've got to have at least 4 units upstairs to really be considered commercial, because then you hit certain types of regulation. And we have tens of thousands of commercial buildings in New York City. And let's also be fairly provincial today. While the panelists may touch on the nation and greater tri-state area, we're all generally provincial folks. It's the 5 boroughs and the surrounding environs. What we're seeing even in the commercial world is while the commercial moratorium on foreclosures did not get instituted until a few weeks, if not months after the resi in New York by our governor, most lenders understood in New York as far back as June of 2019 that commercial foreclosures are going to take a heck of a lot longer in New York. New York has been suffering both on the resi and the commercial side long before COVID. We had technological changes which affected the retail below a lot of buildings, and that can't be changed through the courts. That's just a loss in value through the internet. We had draconian laws passed in June of 2019, which sucked the value out of a lot of buildings because of additional regulation, right or wrong, and I'll refrain from political commentary for the first time in my life. And then you have COVID, which is really the third strike. A lot of lenders recognize that a commercial foreclosure is not the most prudent place to be for the aforementioned reasons, because values have changed. The second reason is that it's going to take a heck of a lot longer. And the third most important reason is they weren't permitted to do it for a while. So what I'm seeing with my colleagues like counsel and folks like David, who has deep pockets, then you have an intermediary like me who gets called by an owner, or I get called by a lender. And they say, hey, we've got a monetary default, or we've got a maturity default, or we've just got a really good borrower who wants to pay but doesn't have the income. Here, broker, give us an opinion of value. And because you spend 70% of your time in bankruptcy court and 60 Center Street as a broker, tell us what you think the litigation analysis is. Well, I hand back, and I'm going to wrap it up in a minute, Adam, I hand back the opinion of value to lender X, and I say your $10 million loan is worth 7. And they say to me, okay, we understand the real estate, but talk to us about a litigation strategy. Before we go to Moritt, before we go to Abrams, and they charge us some money for the analysis, we want you, the broker, not you, Leslie, God forbid, we want to know what is our litigation path. And I say, look, you're going to spend what used to be 1 to 3 years in the foreclosure. Let's say it's a $10 million foreclosure on a building in Brooklyn. Let's say it's a monetary default. You've already noticed the default. It's 30 days later. The lender says, what do? I tell them your building is only worth 7. You're owed 10. Why don't you call up the borrower before you sue them and see if maybe they can do a discounted payoff? If they can't, let's talk about selling that note in the secondary market, not just because Meridian Capital wants to make money, but because you're going to spend 1 to 4 years in a bankruptcy, in a foreclosure. I think that what's happening now is the backlog in the courts and some ill-advised legislation and governance is going to create the largest secondary market for notes, discounted payoffs, and structured deals in the history of New York.
David, so David Goldwasser, I'd like to ask you as someone who also invests in property, how do you see the mezz world? I was talking with someone the other day, and their theory was that there would be very few foreclosures, but might be a little bit more mezz action where they try to retain the property.
Right, so we've seen recently a lot of news about some surrenders to mezzanine lenders from larger institutional players, where I think the divide is, as everybody's been commenting, the mezzanine foreclosure process is not a judicial process, it's a legal process with notice given and an auction held at the attorney's office in a generality. People or private investors who are not institutional have their money invested and are going to claw and fight to keep their properties. Whereas you see with the CMBS foreclosures and or the mezzanine on the institutional players, as we've seen in some hotels, the ownership is given or seceded control over to the mezzanine lenders, who then make a deal with the primary or secured lender in order to take over the property and keep the property running. But as David had mentioned just now, that the UCC foreclosures or since the foreclosure process, the UCC foreclosures are, we'll call it a quicker way to get to the property. We're going to see, I believe, many more bankruptcy filings to stop those UCC foreclosures. Because the state is holding these as non-judicial filings, and there's a split amongst the judges as to the decisions as to whether or not to put temporary restraining orders on foreclosures by UCC. So we don't have a generalized opinion by the courts. And
sorry, can you explain that just again?
So in order to stop something from happening,
Mm-hmm.
People like Chris Gorman go in for temporary restraining orders
Right.
on a daily basis for all types of matters. So in a UCC foreclosure, where it's noticed to be 2 p.m. at XYZ lawyer's office, there is a potential to go in to a state court and say, we want to put a temporary restraining order on this action so they cannot sell my membership interests.
Mm-hmm.
And the judges and the bench have been split on whether or not they have the right to stop that action. Because some judges say it's non-judicial, so they have no place to be involved. And it's you have to bring some regular lawsuit, not just a temporary restraining order. And some judges are saying it's just commercially unreasonable to be doing such a thing, so we're going to put it on anyway.
And so what some people are just running to the bankruptcy to just like freeze everything, or that
filing a bankruptcy on the mezzanine entity, which is the membership interest that you pledge to the mezzanine lender, automatically stops the clock. There is nothing that anybody can do. There's no way around that once you file a bankruptcy. Now,
how come we're not seeing any of those though? Like I'm
Oh yeah. No, there's
I'm in New York.
David's right. No, there are a lot of them. We're handling a bunch of them now.
not in New York right now.
Yes, absolutely.
No, they're starting, Adam. They're definitely starting. And what's also happening is we're I may see it a lot of time before counsel. They come and they say, what's my value here? Geez, I'm just going to toss my membership interests, essentially the keys to the property. I'm going to go to federal court because I know that they're going to notice 30 days from now, they're going to take these keys from me and I'll deal with everything there. I'll go into bankruptcy court, which stays everything. I think you're going to see an incredible industry of that. And it's going to be exponentially more than last time.
Well, Chris, are you
Adam,
something?
The reason why you're focused on actual filings. And you do a UCC, you're just sending out notices. So there's no filing in court. The only filing that goes to court, I'm talking about a state court or a federal court here, I'm not talking about bankruptcy court, is what David Goldwasser is referring to, which is if the borrower decides I'm going to attack these non-judicial means of sale as being unreasonable, the borrower actually initiates litigation, goes to court and says the procedures are not reasonable, which is what the UCC requires. And so you, Mr. or Mrs. State court judge or federal judge, should stop this sale from happening. That's really just a temporary stop. It buys you a little bit more time, but it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot more than that. But it might give you some breathing room to negotiate further and put the process back. But Adam, you're focused on actual filings, and that's why you're not seeing this as much as the rest of us are.
Right. And more often than not, what ends up happening is that they're not going necessarily into state court for the TRO. They're doing exactly what David referred to, is they're putting the membership interest entity into a bankruptcy, most likely the property entity, because if you just put the property entity itself in and not the membership interest, you don't stop the UCC foreclosure because the membership interests are not an asset of the entity that files for bankruptcy. So they're either one filing or two filing, but you got to start with the membership interest, and that's your checkmate. because you take control and then you remove both of those items to the bankruptcy court for consideration.
Leslie, may I ask you a question? Adam, can I
Sure.
switch this around to Leslie and Chris? So as somebody who's still a licensed bankruptcy lawyer, but really only played one on TV for a short while.
So you're doing
You
it
know,
right now. You're playing one on TV right now.
You are.
All right, let me ask you this. You know, last time I was engaged to sell so many of these SARE bankruptcies, single asset real estate.
Yep.
And what I understood really as a broker, which is what I've been for 15 years, is if you had a $50 million property, which is now worth 40, and you had a mortgage that was 42 or 43, you would run to bankruptcy court, but eventually you would have a judge, certainly in the Southern and Eastern District, where I spend most of my time, who would turn to both parties and say, look, what is the plan here? What are you going to do? You tried to sell it. I let you get a broker. We have to have an auction now, and everybody has to take a haircut. The SAREs, what I'm asking the question in here is, it used to be 12 months from beginning to end. You couldn't hide out in bankruptcy court when everybody knew your property wasn't worth as much. Do we think you're going to be able to file an SARE and hide out longer this time?
So my answer to that, I hate to say it this way, is it's going to depend, and it depends on your judge. Okay. So depending on which judge you get, and there is still a huge difference between Southern and Eastern District in that regard. And depending upon what you can utilize to delay things, because COVID has been this great equalizer.
Leslie?
Yes.
Clarify the distinction between, just very quickly, between the Southern and Eastern.
Sure. So the Southern
judges?
District of, the Southern District of, you mean in terms of geography or?
No, in terms of like why they're different judges.
Because the
Keeping
Southern
in mind that
District-
Leslie earns her living in these districts.
Yes, I
so-
do, but I can say it in a polite way. So the Southern District, generally speaking, more so, and I'm talking about city versus Southern District, upstate
Right,
New
right.
York, focus, well, upstate to the White Plains area, focuses on more commercial. They're looking at Lehman. They're looking at very large cases. They have very little patience at times. They'll cut through sometimes the nonsense sooner. They'll get to the heart of it quicker. I'm not telling you that the Eastern District judges, which tend to be a little bit more of a consumer-based, smaller run court, won't get there. It's also going to depend on the judge that you get. Some judges have a lot more tolerance and patience for BS. Okay. And so
Could you
sometimes
define
it's the
BS?
fact.
Could you
Well,
define
yeah,
BS?
can I say bullshit? I can even name names right now. But honestly, without naming names, seriously, dealing with a case I had recently, it took a very long time for me to get to the end as a lender in a case where if I had two of the other judges, it would have been a 3-month, 4-month issue. So to answer the question of can you hide out, I think it depends on your judge. I think it depends on sometimes if you can utilize factors like COVID, because if I hear COVID one more time as a reason that nobody can do anything, I'm going to lose it, because, that's not always the reason you can't do something. But will they be able to hide out? Here's my bigger concern. The bankruptcy courts are going to get tremendously backed up because people are going to utilize it either defensively or offensively, because nobody, either the foreclosure action is going to take too long, the borrower is going to use it to defeat a UCC sale and keep the keys to the kingdom, as you said it. And so there's going to be a flood of these. There is going to be a limitation, even in fairness, how quickly courts can deal with these things. And because each one of them is its own little enterprise of value and experts and timing, you may, as a result, have a delay inherent in the process.
Leslie, are they trying to ramp up right now?
When you say ramp up, the judges, you are limited right now. So the Eastern District has a full bench. There are no other judgeships available. Southern District has 2 that have not yet been, haven't been confirmed. I believe they've been filled, but not confirmed. You have a fair amount of vacancies around the country. I think the bankruptcy courts may be behind in terms of what they're going to need to handle this. The second half of my practice, I serve as a neutral, a dispute resolution professional, both as a AAA arbitrator and a mediator. The courts in general, both state courts and bankruptcy courts, are turning to neutrals as an a supplement as a relief to the clogging in the courts. That's why for anybody that practices in state court, you've seen mandatory mediation, presumptive mediation. You're going to see that more in the bankruptcy courts, as well as a way for people to either choose to or courts to utilize a way to unclog the system, because there's a limit to what they can ramp up. They can't just create easily another federal judgeship.
Chris, just well, we continue what you're going to do, but then in a minute, if you pivot to want to start looking at different verticals, for instance, like hotels, like what your expectation for that is.
Sure. So let me just expand very briefly on what Leslie was just saying. I think whatever backlog you see in the bankruptcy courts, I believe it's going to pale in comparison to the backlog in the New York State courts.
I would agree with you.
For a variety of different reasons, some of which is volume, some of which is technology related. I think there are a lot of different factors, but if you're given the choice of fighting out a foreclosure in state court for 3 to 5 years as a lender, or your borrower filing for bankruptcy, and you may be getting one of those good judge draws that will allow you to move this process forward a lot more quickly, lenders should not view the fact that their borrowers are filing for bankruptcy as a bad thing. It could conceivably be a very good thing for a lender. So I see some comments talking about state court versus bankruptcy court. To me, that's really a critical distinction. Now, in terms of asset classes, Adam, you mentioned hospitality. My view is, hospitality could be, how bad hospitality gets will depend on how quickly we rebound to put people in hotel rooms. Okay, so if a year from now we're still talking about restrictions and lockdowns, I think hospitality has a very, very difficult time. If in the next 3 months we start coming out of this and we all start seeing those people walking around the city that we used to see all the time, they're called tourists, it might be able to buoy itself a little bit more. So the answer to how hospitality rebounds and how bad the foreclosures are in the hospitality space, I think remains unanswered. No matter what, there's going to be a high volume of foreclosures and bankruptcies in the residential space. It's just how high is that ceiling? We don't know yet.
Adam, I just want to interject before you ask me the questions. A distinction between state court and bankruptcy court for everybody who's listening. In bankruptcy court, there's a process and timelines. So when somebody files a bankruptcy, there are timelines per occurrence that has to happen. The only thing that can change those timelines is a judge's calendar and schedule, which they might, or you can ask for extensions, but everything is a statutory timeline. Versus state court, where it's really going to depend upon the judge and their courtroom and how they run their calendar and their own procedure. So you'll see backlog in the state courts for years sometimes, whereas in a bankruptcy court, because statutorily, there are things that have to move along in the case.
Why does that exist? Why isn't there a process? I don't want to have a big, just
Right.
2 minutes, 1 minute. Don't go crazy on that, but just.
It was just the federal rules of bankruptcy have a timeline so that the bankruptcy can happen and a plan can be executed, because any bankruptcy has to exit with a plan or a dissolution.
Right.
Whereas state court matters are matters of subjectivity. You wronged me. How do I write it? It's really just subjective.
The foreclosure is the thing. It's like I
Right,
borrowed
but you
money.
didn't pay. Why didn't you pay? Because I didn't want to, because of COVID. So the answers are not static. When bankruptcy, it's a right or left
Right.
answer.
Uh-huh.
I
And
mean,
then-
Leslie can expand a little further, but I just want to
So-
make that distinction.
Wait, before that, wait, I wanted to ask David, just sort of pivoting for a minute
Sure.
to
Anything you
essentially
want.
getting business. Like how are you looking right now to find opportunities?
How am I looking to find opportunities?
Yeah, like how do you
You know,
to
people
invest and that different things?
you know, I'm on webinars. Attorney, no, you know, I get a lot of calls from attorney referrals and from, you know, people who are looking to fix their situation. They're stuck. They don't know what to do. There's a UCC sale in a week. How do I deal with it? You know, I've been involved with most of the major private lenders on both sides of the resolution. But, you know, part of it is people always need money. So they say, okay, but they think money can fix things. But if they're not realistic as to the plan, then the money's not going to fix it. So somebody might say, I need $1 million. What do you need $1 million for? Well, if I have $1 million, I can, you know, get through this. But that doesn't always, that $1 million has to be applied properly, or that 10 million or the 50 million, whatever the number is. So without having a full plan of what they're going to do to be able to present, whether it's to the lender, to the partners, to the court, what have you, it's very hard to put that money to work in a proper way that keeps them going. So what we do is we look at the whole situation. We work on what a plan looks like to get to the end, because people, as I mentioned, even in the state court, they don't know what their exit looks like. They just want to save another day. And just saving another day doesn't get you anywhere, which is what, you know, Chris and Leslie and David are saying, that sometimes people just try to kick the can down the road. But that's not, you know, especially in this go around, you can kick the can down the road due to COVID, due to this, due to that, but you're not going to get out. So what people don't realize is that if you don't actually do something, the interest is going to accrue. The judges are not going to magically wipe away the interest, even though they're magically wiping away the rent, but that's a different discussion from politics. But, you know, your problem is not going to go away. So, you know, when people, again, the people refer to me to try to give them a reality check, and then, you know, we guide them through. I mean, that's really what it is. And sometimes we invest, sometimes we advise. It just depends on the situation and the reality.
Let me cut off Goldwasser and answer your question with a finer point, because everybody's being genteel. You asked, how do you get business? Goldwasser, if you've ever seen the movie Pulp Fiction, is Harvey Keitel in the end. He comes in, all right, he hands somebody a couple of gold coins and he fixes it. Oftentimes it's money, because even though he looks like the Jewish George Hamilton, he's in his 50s. He's been doing it for 30 years. He has a big pile of money and a network of lawyers, and he's been through hundreds of bankruptcies. How do venerable counsel that we have online get business? They're experts in the field and they give advice. And Leslie is the type of attorney, and I'm sorry, I don't know Chris as well, but his reputation is sterling. Leslie's the kind of bankruptcy lawyer who tells clients, bankruptcy is not for you. You have a bigger issue. A Chapter 11 will only keep you safe for 12 months. It's going to be converted to a 7, which is a liquidation. You're going to lose your building. Leslie's the type of person who is smart enough to say, why don't you talk to Meridian Investment Sales? Let's get a value. Let's get a mortgage. Oh, you know, and I'm not doing a commercial, but Adam, how do your listeners get business doing this? Speak to everyone. Speak to everybody up and down the food chain, but figure out what your place is. If you think you're going to come into New York City with $10 million of cash and be in and out in 2 years or 3 years and turn it into 30, this is a much different cycle than it was in 2008 through 2010. We have fundamentals that are not going to bounce back as quickly. So you have to figure out your place in the food chain and what type of property you want to hold on to. You have to hold on to real estate longer to get your values back this time.
So here, I want to look quickly at this information. So we, at PincusCo, we went into the state court filings and we looked at pre-foreclosures of all types. And then we removed the ones that are the conversion, which is like older pre-filings. And instead of like the numbers of like hundreds and hundreds of filings every month, what we found is that there were actually far fewer. So for condo and co-op liens in September, there were 43, there were 20, and then they're down this month, it's lower. The residential mortgages were high, up close to 100 for the past September, October, and November. Commercial was in sort of the 40s. And then the next, this is looking by borough, Queens in the residential, they were in the 40s, and Brooklyn sort of in the 20s and 30s, but not the hundreds. So I wanted to ask you all about sort of the numbers that are out there and how you might put this into context. Like, are you seeing tons and tons of foreclosure filings, or does this look closer to what you're seeing?
So Adam, we had this conversation before we jumped on when we had the prep in the green room, the virtual green room. You know, I actually did some research in advance of this, and just speaking strictly, because you showed a couple of slides, and I want to make sure the viewers understand. Let's call residential foreclosures. And we all understand that they tend to be higher generally in economically challenged neighborhoods, East New York, Brownsville, non-hipster Bushwick. If you go back 6 years prior to March of 2020, you were averaging, according to my numbers, and your slides, I may be off slightly, we're in between 470 and 670 a month of routine foreclosures during what were considered, and I guess 2014 through February 2020 was considered normal times, even though real estate was in a day crescendo. Economically, the country was doing very well. You were seeing 480 to 680 filings. That went down to as few as 7 or 8, March, April, May, and I don't even know why there were that many when there was a moratorium. They have bounced back. The most recent numbers that I was able to pull, and I'll circulate this after, were 517 in those same 3 principal neighborhoods. So the newspapers, of course, report that there's an exponential spike in filings. That exponential spike in filings is still 20% pre-COVID numbers. And those are numbers that are still 20% what was 6 years preceding COVID. So I think that there may be a spike, but it's still a number that is humming well below normal. I don't think that there's an incredible amount of new filings because of the legislation, but in keeping with the theme, boy, is it coming. I would say by Q2 of next year, when the vaccine is all the way out, and we have governors who are going to say, okay, we have to lift the moratoriums, inundated. Q2 of next year, you will not be able to file. I bet that you're going to see some of the court systems, the electronic filing systems. I'm not saying this in jest. They're going to crash. There's going to be that many filings.
Yeah, the reason why I started talking about an avalanche was because I believe, Adam, your numbers are closer to being accurate than the numbers that David just recited. And if, Adam, your numbers are accurate, or even if you're in between, let's just say you're in between the 2 numbers, the truth is somewhere in the middle, that it is still exponentially lower than it usually is. And so when you take that coupled with the fact that the number of filings are going to be astronomically higher than they usually are, I think you get very quickly to a conclusion that at some point, I'm an attorney, I'm not a market prognosticator, but at some point that avalanche is coming, and you're going to make up the difference between the low filings as they exist today, and you're going to have to get them to those exponentially higher number of filings. And I think it's going to happen once it starts. It's going to happen very quickly.
And what are people doing to sort of prepare to either defend themselves from the ownership side, and then to get a piece of that, to figure out how to get in that like massive movement? what are people doing?
Well, it's interesting. Let's stick with the residential. I don't think people are doing a whole heck of a lot. If you look at a lot of the firms, the law firms, I'm again speaking about strictly from the legal profession. A lot of the law firms that do a lot of the foreclosure filings are firms that deal in volume, and a lot of those firms, because of the lack of volume right now, have furloughed and laid off a lot of the attorneys working for them. So while you may think that there's a bunch of attorneys sitting in a back room somewhere preparing the foreclosure filings, they're not. They're not.
What about the, like, I also track it, looking at ACRES every day, these memorandum of contracts, which typically in sort of the normal season, you'd have like people going to go to someone's house and trying to get them put into contracts so they can buy it later. There's almost none of that either. Like, how come someone's not going to like to buy people's houses?
Because Adam, if there's an outbreak of salmonella, you know, where you get one of these reports on the news that you shouldn't eat romaine lettuce, and then you go into, you know, whatever grocery store, you see a ton of romaine there. It's not getting pulled. It's no different than the houses right now. Why would anybody, I'm a real estate broker, and I'm about to posit this. Why would anybody in their right mind spend something on what's likely going to be a falling knife? If everybody in this panel and logic dictates that filings are going to increase, if there are 10,000 homes on the market, but there are 7,000 foreclosures for comparable homes, where do you think it's smarter to buy the home? Now's not the time. There aren't memorandums of understanding at the moment because it's the wrong time to be memorializing anything. I think the smartest thing to do right now is, if you're a homeowner or a commercial building owner, is to be speaking with non-conventional lenders, folks who will actually lend you more than you likely would get from a portfolio lender. I think it's time to look at creative partnerships. And I think it's time to also sit down with your conventional lenders and say, look, values have eroded. I owe you $10 million. I'm going to write you a check for another 500 grand, but I need you to come down 500 grand. It's time for workouts, negotiations. And the only, you know, most of the sales that I'm handling are non-discretionary sales. They're compulsory sales. We're finishing up bankruptcies and note sales and UCC sales. Those are the ones where you're going to have a ton of buyers. But if I were to just take a plain vanilla piece of real estate out now, a hotel, I'm in the market with 6 East 32nd Street, the building that I could have got 50 million for 12 months ago. I'm struggling to get 42, 43. So that's why you're not seeing a lot of memorandums of understanding. It's the wrong time.
Well, so I want to start looking at some questions that are being sent in, but here's a question that was from earlier. But I wanted to, right now, can this be seen as an opportunity to flush away a bad project without it being perceived as a failure? Do you think people will be doing that?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I've used the coronavirus as an excuse for everything, including cutting lines recently. I'm saying that in jest, of course. Of course. You have to remember that the real estate downturn started in the summer of, David, was it 19, when the laws changed for multifamily and sentiment shifted. There were 800,000 ghost units under construction. The absorption rate would never take that. So I don't think a lot of courts are going to accept that argument, but it's certainly going to be made. And one of the great things about our courts is you can plead in the alternative, meaning you could file and say, Your Honor, I don't owe the bank the money because they didn't give me my money quickly enough. Coronavirus. You can even do contradicting theories in your pleadings. So you would be I dare say you would be a lawyer who would be derelict of duty if you didn't hide behind Corona. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's true.
David Goldwasser, I wanted to ask, how do you think the 1031 market will be impacted with all of this right now?
You know, I'm still seeing across the board people talking about having 1031 money, where I'm seeing that the interest, which generally has still been, is triple net properties, where people will park their money and hope for some appreciation. We have one client who is in the has many triple net properties in the pharmacies of Rite Aid and CVS. So he's getting an influx of inquiries to sell his properties to 1031 people. But people with the 1031s are hard to find the typical other properties they were looking for appreciation, because as David Schechtman just said, you're possibly holding on to a falling knife. So you don't want to put your money into something that could drop in value, whether, because in New York City with all the residential, mess of, prices of rents, you don't want to buy a residential building where your values are going to go down, or potentially go down, or your rents are going to go down, or people are not going to populate your building. So where I see it going is out of town. I don't think New York City is a vibrant place for 1031 at the moment, unless you've been in contract or something that you want to buy, or but I don't see, and I hear people going out of town with their 1031 money because they don't want to be stuck in a stagnant or down market, with their profits.
So here, this is a question from a reader. What are the current best strategies for landlords with non-paying tenants? I guess put that in the context of a foreclosure. I guess sort of imagine you've got a landlord that's in a tough situation, is not getting paid.
So you're looking at an eviction. You're looking at commercial evictions, which are currently frozen by proclamation of the governor. And while that's been extended, I think it's now January 31. I think they kicked it again. The problem is even if, and there's two issues with it, and I won't go too deep in the legal, but what that actually means. Does it mean you can't commence a new one? What does it mean about existing ones? What about ones where the judgment's about to issue? But if they're already in court, Administrative Judge Marks also issued an administrative order, which basically says if you have a commercial eviction in the process, you've got to come to I'll call it a COVID conference. I know he has a different name for it, but the court is going to have to take a look at where you are in the process, what potential impact COVID has on what's going on, and then they'll decide what you can or cannot do in this process. And so from a landlord perspective, it's hard enough sometimes outside of this to get an expedited relief against a tenant that's non-paying and get them out if they're a holdover, et cetera. In the current environment with these orders and others coming in and people hesitant to kick people out because of COVID or anything else, it's going to take you a while to get somebody out. It becomes a real issue.
Another way I wanted to ask about this is what I'm seeing it's not instead of an ejectment or something, but there's also going after the guarantor. Is that seen as a different,
well, you can go after the guarantor. So, I mean, putting aside in a foreclosure process where you're dealing with something called election of remedies, when you're going versus the process versus a monetary, in a straight landlord situation, if you can go after a guarantor. Those are monetary remedies, and that's fine. That's not going to happen that much quicker either, because you've got backed up court systems, and I'm talking about state courts. They've downsized the court system. Judges have been given pink slips, so they've reduced the commercial and other parts of the court system. And so if you have a guarantor that's going to fight you and defend as opposed to getting a default judgment, and if you're getting a default judgment, trust me, that guarantor has no assets. You have a lovely piece of paper. You could frame it someplace and look at it day to day. But anybody with assets is going to fight you. You may eventually win, but to David's point, you're going to get, one from column A, two from column B, three from column C, and all the reasons why they don't owe you the money. It's an option. It just isn't necessarily going to get you there. You'll win eventually if you're in the right, but it may be a long period of time.
Well, Adam, since you brought up the landlord-tenant aspect of this, I'm going to, again, briefly say it's bleak it's bleak. And if you said, well, what do you tell somebody who's got a tenant who's not paying? I say get in line and get in line as fast as you can, because that line is going to be long.
Yep.
And when we've talked about backlogs in courts, we've been entirely talking about Supreme Court, bankruptcy court. I think those landlord-tenant courts, the backlog there is going to be tremendous. And I don't know how well equipped they are to deal with it for, again, a variety of different reasons.
In terms of,
And
but a question in terms of
further,
getting in line, is that super crucial, or is it like the logic of your complaint? Like, are there multiple factors that will help your, other than obviously the parties, but does getting in line, is that very important into how quickly you can move ahead?
Yes.
well, you can't get the relief that you want until you get in line.
Definitely that, but
It's essential, and generally speaking, cases are dealt with as they're filed. And we talked about guarantees. Not to be Debbie Downer, but the New York City has passed legislation that has put a hold on the ability to enforce guarantees in the landlord-tenant context. And on November 25th, just a few weeks ago, a very respected federal judge upheld the constitutionality of that legislation. So it only covers a year. It only covers March 2020 to March 2021. But for that period, the guarantors have no skin in the game, and you're never going to be able to get that money. So there's a lot of difficulty in the landlord-tenant space right now for landlords.
Right. And if I could circle back for 2 seconds, it doesn't necessarily always apply in terms of landlords, but Chris made a comment a while back, bearing in mind that lenders themselves don't exactly have control over the bankruptcy, causing the bankruptcy filing. But if your borrower or tenant ends up in bankruptcy, it is not always a bad thing. And quite frankly, I have worked on a variety of cases, and one in particular was a Chapter 7 where I worked with the trustee because we wanted to get the property sold in the bankruptcy. Did I have to tip out to the estate as a result? Yes. But getting a sale process effectuated for a commercial piece of real estate in under 120 days in a bankruptcy, as opposed to 3.5 plus in Kings County, and it cost my clients some money, what it saved them in carrying costs, legal fees, interest, insurance, et cetera, totally worth it. So, if you're on the lender's side, and again, it's judge dependent, sometimes situation dependent, even then you can get to a better result, even if it's a negotiated resolution or a 363, which is a sale process in bankruptcy, that is much faster than the state court system. So while it's check and checkmate, you start your process and they file, checkmate may be for you back in the bankruptcy court.
so this is a pivot from the courts. Throw this to Schechtman, but how are distressed is the question. How are distressed properties being valued right now? What are some benchmarks? Like, how are you trying to figure out if?
Sure. So in constant contact with my team, we did 27 broker opinions of value, looking at my notes, 27 broker opinions of value last week for 6 different lenders. That included 2 servicers, 2 portfolio lenders, 2 major national portfolios, and some non-conventional folks. We've done over 212 opinions of value since Memorial Day. They range from $3.2 million to $251 million in the 5 boroughs, Nassau, Suffolk, and a little bit of Jersey down to Monmouth and Westchester, really in the southern eastern districts.
Wait, so how are you coming up with the?
I get it. So how are we coming up with the values?
How do you
Adam, that was a stall tactic. It's hard. It's really hard. So let me give you an example. The number one thing is there is no puffery in brokerage these days. If you want to be a successful broker today, no puffery. 3-4 years ago, you'd say, it's worth 10. I think maybe I can get 11, 12. Today, it's the exact opposite. We were engaged. We gave a broker opinion of value on, I'm going to answer your question. We gave a broker opinion of value on Memorial Day to a lender who subsequently engaged us to sell a senior secured mortgage. Let's call it a plus or minus $30 million mortgage. We told this lender we believed we could recover 90 cents on the dollar. We were engaged exclusively. We marketed it throughout the summer. Hopefully today we're signing a contract about 85 cents on the dollar. The lender is disappointed in us and has said, you put in writing you were going to get 90%. I hope this wasn't a bait and switch. We have a long relationship with this lender. I said, not only was it not a bait and switch, if my degree of variance is 5%, this is not nanotechnology. Your rents have fallen 27%, 27% collections since Memorial Day. I'm lucky I was able to get 85%. It is an extremely difficult thing to value a building today if it's not 100% occupied with income, with a quality tenant in it. And that transcends asset classes. The only things that are not hard to value today, industrial.
But what, okay, so what,
raw land.
What do you throw in there? So if you're like, okay, your rent roll should be like $60,000 a month, and right now you've got 2 vacancies and 2 sick people and 2 people not
Right.
paying, and you're only getting.
There's a paucity of data. So what we're doing is we're giving a greater range. If a lender or an owner comes to us and says, I got offers for 15 pre-COVID, can you do an analysis? I may not even want to sell. It's something that most brokers do. Give me a comprehensive analysis of my value. We may say, if X, then Y, if Y, then Z, meaning if this tenant renews and they renegotiate in this range, then your property is worth X. If you continue to have to abate or you have to continue to do this, we think your property is worth X. We are unfortunately giving a choose your own adventure type opinion of value. Are there existences now where somebody says, here's my building in Soho, what's it worth? And I say it's worth 54 to 57? Yes, but those are generally close to 100% tenancy. It is a imprecise science to value real estate in New York City today. And my colleagues and competitors, in the same cast, we all speak. There's some honor amongst thieves, and we all concur. I will actually pick up the phone and say to David Falk, hey, what is office worth? Can you take a look at my work? I want to make sure that I'm right on this. But the most important thing, Adam, and I'm finishing up, when you're valuing a property today, is to be on the phone with other owners. So for instance, we were just valuing something down on Orchard Street. I called up my friend Bill Abramson, who owns on that block, and I said, what are you getting for rents? Because I'm not sure what to put in here. And you have to ask other owners who are actually signing leases. Then you plug those leases in yours. Very imprecise science, and you need a lot of help from third parties.
I'm going to add to this for 1 second. I just want to add to this 1 second is I'm in the middle of one assignment with a workout on a portfolio of buildings. When we started the assignment in September, we had a rent roll of X in a certain neighborhood that people were renting by the bed in Brooklyn. So, each room, each bed had a value. From September to November, the values and the amounts per bed went down dramatically in that neighborhood, whereas in another neighborhood a few blocks away, it was greater. So it's even harder with David's job of valuing, because things are changing exponentially. The renewals are not there, the renegotiation of the leases, it's literally on a month-by-month basis, things are changing. And it's not even, it's a very, very challenging thing to do. In my world, where we're trying to represent to a lender, we think that the long view is like this, because the long view changes on a month-by-month basis, which historically we've never had this. So it's very, very hard to put values on buildings, as opposed to what was said in the beginning by David, is that you have to look at this as a 5-year play. You can't look at this as today, because if you look at it as today, there's no value. The value is just a number that is what you think it is because in 5 years, I think it'll be worth this. So it's a little bit skewed as to the normal way of buying real, or what we had to be normal way of buying real estate.
So, well, that was not my alarm, but it is 3 o'clock. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I had a good time. It was very interesting. I hope you had a good time listening. And we're going to be sending out an email to everybody with a link to our a link to this video. Also want to promote in January, we're doing a video on nuisance tenants from both the landlord side, sort of the pro advocacy side, and then the just sort of landlord side, getting people out. So I think it's a very interesting debate. I think both sides kind of want to get rid of dangerous tenants, but they can't really come together. So we're going to be talking about that. But today I'd like to thank Chris, two Davids, and Leslie, and I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Adam.
everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you.